Welcome everyone to this ATARC webinar on the new GSA Digital Worker Credentialing Handbook. Today's webinar is presented by the ATARC RPA Working Group. Our guest speakers today are Daria Medved, Deputy Director, Emerging Technology Policy at GSA, and Ken Myers, Cyber Policy and Strategy Planner at GSA. My name is Bill Bunce, and I'm the Director of Federal Sales at Automation Anywhere. The first question you might be asking yourself is, what is a digital worker? A digital worker is simply software designed to emulate a human by performing activities and tasks using automation or AI-based skills. What I've observed is that many organizations across public sector specifically are reluctant to jump into the automation space due to concerns about security, and given the sensitivity of government data, that makes a lot of sense to me. The question I get most often is, how do we provide an intelligent automation, or, how can we be assured that bots or automations won't be roaming the network, touching systems that they're not supposed to? The answer to that question is to guarantee, in order to guarantee security, is that you need to be able to audit what the automation is doing on the network. And step number one of auditing an automation is obviously credentialing that automation so that you can identify it on the network and track it. With that, I'm sure we'll learn a lot more from today's presentation. And so let me turn it over to Daria and Ken, and they can take us through the new handbook. Daria?
Thank you very much. Ken, would you like to share our slides?
Yes, I will.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for inviting us to present to you guys today. As Bill had mentioned, my name is Daria Medved. I'm part of the Emerging Tech Division, and along with Ken Myers, who's part of the Identity Assurance and Trusted Access Division, we are within the Office of Government-Wide Policy at GSA. And we're here to talk about digital identity. All right, next slide. So first of all, can we get a poll question up? Are you using automated technologies today? We'll take a moment for everyone to give us an answer here. And then how do we see the results here? Somewhere? Oh, there we go. Ah, very interesting results. It seems like the majority of us are using automated technologies, hopefully some sort of AI. And we have seen that there is a huge growth of AI in government today and in the future. At least, and these statistics are probably already outdated, but at least 45% of federal agencies have experimented with AI tools. Non-defense AI research and development is doubling this fiscal year for the government, and agencies increasingly rely on the digital workforce. We're seeing this in a number of areas. So with all of this, we have recognized that there's a new type of worker that really needs to have a consistent way to be credentialed. And this is, next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, there we go. The digital worker. So the digital worker it's becoming a lot more increasing that we are seeing digital workers not necessarily taking the place of corporeal workers, but at least on the networks, we need to be able to recognize whether something is a digital worker or a normal human, because as Bill had mentioned, digital workers don't act the same way on networks. And so they can trigger a lot of the red flags in security that say that, oh, you guys are getting hacked, when in reality, it's just a digital worker. So there needs to be a way to recognize these digital workers in our networks. And what we found in researching how digital workers are currently credentialed within federal firewalls is that they're not really recognizable. There's not too much consistency across the board. And there does need to be a way to be able to tell digital workers apart on federal networks. And not only because of OMB Memo 1917, but just as a best practice. So what we did is we put together an interagency workshop. We interviewed a bunch of agencies on how they're currently using digital workers and how they're credentialing digital workers within their agencies. And then we analyzed all of the gaps and the challenges, both from a policy perspective and from an implementation perspective. And we put together a set of recommendations from the Emerging Tech Division that then Ken very nicely took over to the Identity Assurance and Trusted Access Division and created a digital playbook for us. So Ken, on to you.
Great, thanks, Daria. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Ken Myers, really excited to jump in here and talk about digital worker playbook. We have another polling question. Kirsten, you mind throwing that polling question up? Great, thanks. So next polling question, what guidance do you use to credential your digital workers? So we have agency or company developed guidance, vendor recommended practices. That's why we're here today, to learn about it, to learn about your playbook, which I'm pretty excited about. And the last one is nothing. So what type of guidance are you using today? And the results are in agency or company developed guidance. That's great. It's great to see that you have guidance of your own that you're working with. So Daria mentioned there is a policy recommendation paper. And from that paper, we developed the digital worker playbook. So within OMB Memo 1917, it calls on agencies to manage the digital identity of automated technologies, such as robotic process automation, RPA, tools, and artificial intelligence. So one of the main questions we get, well, digital worker, isn't that a non-person entity? Isn't that the same thing as NPE? Not really, and it kind of depends on how your agency defines NPE. But if you look at OMB Memo 1917, it kind of clearly differentiates devices from non-person entities from automated technologies. And automated technologies is the scope of this digital worker playbook. So within the playbook and the next couple of slides, you'll see there's 3 distinct steps. It's determining the impact and creating an identity by assigning a sponsor and custodian. And then the last step is provisioning and governing that digital identity. It's a cyclic. You go through a cycle. And then where and when. So I wish I could say that we're publicly posting the playbook today. Unfortunately, it's still in a communications and review, but it will be publicly posted. And when it does get publicly posted, we'll share it with the community here. So jumping right into the steps, I mentioned that there's 3 steps in establishing identities. So the first step is determining the impact. So that's a risk assessment. Within that, you have your ICAM governance structure. So for anyone that's not familiar with the FICAM architecture, OMB Memo 1917, or maybe FICAM program management, we outline something called an ICAM governance structure, which is actually a cross-functional team of not just IT professionals, but also human resources, everyone that has a part within an identity component within an agency. And that's making sure that that digital worker is also included in that overall governance structure. Also within that first step is obtaining an impact score. So that score is pretty much kind of like an impact level, if you're familiar with doing 830 risk assessments, right? Low, medium, moderate, low, moderate, high, that type of thing. So that's also, we're talking about within a digital worker, is that you arrive at an impact score. And that what's kind of influences the next steps when you're creating your identity. So pretty much overall, right, the steps, it's a structured process to establish an identity. Daria mentioned the recommendations paper. Within that, interviewing agencies, we found that a lot of agencies were using human-based identity processes to credential a digital worker, and it doesn't always work like that. There's some things that are specific to a human that don't correlate to a digital identity. So jumping right in, I'm going to go in a little deep here on step one. I think we have another polling question here. That polling question is, do you conduct a risk assessment before credentialing a digital worker? Yes or no? So let's see. Oh, good. So 67% say yes. That's a great sign, and that kind of aligns with what we have in the playbook here. So I mentioned this ICAM oversight. So it's really important that you establish governance over all identities within your agency, not just human and not just digital, but all of them, that all of them go through some type of process when you're establishing that identity. So the impact score, and this is a 6-factor impact score. The important pieces of the impact scores really touches on what differentiates a digital worker from a human worker, right? If you think about a digital worker, whether that's a robotic process automation like a bot, a chat bot, or something else, there's the ability for them to be supervised or unsupervised. There's the ability for them to use information and then arrive at a decision. And then what happens with that decision? Does other actions take place from that decision? So there's a lot of benefits, but there's also a little bit of risk when you're using a digital worker. And so that's the main focus of this impact score, is understanding the impact, whether good or bad, of that digital worker. So from that score, then you arrive at an actual level, and that level will align with follow-on activities in the next 2 steps. So that level, the level that we use, the methodology is actually within the playbook to understand what's encompassed within each level. It's actually based on NIST Special Publication 830 for risk management. So the main takeaway from this, like I mentioned, all workers, human and digital, should have oversight from their ICAM governance structure. So then you use the impact evaluation matrix to determine the level of potential adverse impact. If you have any more questions or about the ICAM governance structure, you can actually look. We have a guide, an ICAM program management guide, that's available at that's papamike.idmanagement.gov, and that kind of explains what an ICAM governance structure is, what's a government body, what offices within your agency should be included within this government body, and it also goes into what an ICAM program management office is. So the second main takeaway here is not every digital identity requires, or not, I'm sorry, not every digital worker requires a digital identity. Especially if it's at the low impact level, you may not need to establish its own identity, but really it goes back to your own agency guidance and processes. So if you do require to have every identity within your agency, sure. Sorry, I'm swimming back and forth. Sorry about that. So if you have an agency policy that says that all workers, human and digital, must have an identity, then you should follow your own agency processes. But by no means are we recommending that every digital identity should have a worker. I mentioned the 6 factors in the impact score. And that factors in whether digital worker is autonomous, does it provide recommendation, is it supervised or unsupervised? And usually you can expect a higher risk if it is unsupervised. So the other main takeaway from this is unidentified digital worker is different than a human worker. There's certain aspects or certain attributes from an identity perspective that agencies use with a human worker that don't necessarily apply to a digital worker. For example, location, or a device serial number, or sometimes agencies tie identities to specific devices like laptops or desktops, stuff like that. Those are the types of things that don't necessarily apply with a digital worker. I'll move to the next slide here. So we have another polling question number 4. So do you assign a human sponsor and a custodian to a digital worker? So this is actually step 2 within the playbook. And the main reason why you want to assign sponsors and custodians is that someone is managing that digital worker. So wait a second for the response on that one. And the results are in is yes, both sponsor and a custodian. Wow, that's this is a pretty advanced group here, considering following your head in all the wickets here. This is great. So within step 2, you're conducting a sponsorship process. So within that, you're assigning a sponsor and custodian. So a sponsor is usually an executive. It could be a CISO. It could be another executive within the IT or security function of your office, and they're the primary individual that's accountable for that digital worker. The custodian is more of your day-to-day manager of the digital worker. It could be a federal employee, it could be a contractor, but the idea is that there's both executive management and then day-to-day management of a digital worker. The second part of step 2 is actually conducting a validation process. And this actually goes towards a little bit more of the identity governance functions of a life cycle management. So some of those points right there are talking about were access reviews. So access reviews being least privilege. The idea that you should only have as many privileges, as much access as you need to complete a task. So part of that, one thing that we found was that due potentially to limitations on the agency's identity management system, digital workers were required to be supervised because they had a system account. And that was the only account that a digital worker could use. And due to that, the compensating control is that it required to be supervised. The excess privileges that come with that group or system account cause it to be supervised. So an additional governance factor in there is also separation of duties. So does the digital worker have excess privileges that could result in fraud, theft, or other errors? In addition, a code review. So how often is their code reviewed? Ethics and bias. Is there an ethics and bias review of the digital worker? So within that ethics and bias review, your agency may not have guidance on ethics or bias, and there actually isn't any formal guidance out right now on how to conduct an ethics or bias review. But you can always work with other agencies within your community of interest to develop your own set of recommendations before formal guidance is published. Lastly, within that validation step is a periodic recertification and acknowledgement of the review. So that could happen based on the impact level. It could be a 6-month or 1-year recertification. But most important, the recommendation is don't set up an out-of-band cycle that causes more work for your security or IT or whoever's responsible for this process. If possible, you should integrate these processes into existing reviews and acknowledgement cycles, especially if you have an existing identity governance process. If you could integrate these reviews into that process right there. So recertification, I had mentioned, it's required more frequently for higher levels of risk, as well as ethics and bias reviews also. So why is this an important place? So if agencies create an identity, and I mentioned before that they usually follow that same process used for human workers. So the main difference there is that digital workers don't go through the same process when you're onboarding a new employee. So this is supposed to mimic that process in a way that's tailored specifically to the digital worker. Human worker, we have managers. A digital worker, they now have a sponsor and a custodian. So it's very similar, but it's tailored specifically for a digital worker. Why is this another bullet of why this is important. So there's a lack of consistency across agencies and adapting processes to the digital worker. So we tried answering that specifically with this process right here. So during the agency interviews for the recommendation paper, so our group found agencies were using group and system accounts like I had mentioned, that led to excessive privileges. So the overall intent of this step is to allow agencies to use unsupervised digital workers by providing that worker with a unique identity that enforces least privilege and separation of duties, which are two key identity management concepts. So it looks like we got a question in the chat. How would sponsorship and custodian status work with citizen developers? So any federal worker can create a bot and run it locally. Citizen developer. So maybe you can, maybe I can come back to that one. If you could clarify what a citizen developer is. I'm not sure if that's just a citizen that's providing development support, but if you can clarify on the citizen developer part, you can come back and assist with that. Any federal worker. So I'm gonna try my best to answer this one. So how would sponsorship and custodian status work with any federal worker?
It's possible, Ken, that it comes back to the risk level. You had mentioned that every digital worker may not require credentialing. If this is a bot that is operating under the authority of that citizen developer, and so by default, then they become the sponsor potentially. There's a movement. I know the Air Force is using a lot of citizen developers where, you know, instead of using a centralized center of excellence where, you know, automations and AIs are developed in a center of excellence, you have individual employees building bots for their own use and running on their own machines.
Okay, yeah, I see. That's a good point.
So I can actually take this one a little bit. So yeah, as Bill did mention, and I think we are potentially going to bring this up as well, not every single digital worker requires a credentialing. And we do go into that in the playbook as well. If it's a low adverse impact on a system, then they don't need to have a credential unless there's a need for them to have a very specific credential, in which case you would just follow the moderate level credentialing process. So for anything that federal workers develop that would fall under the low category, then that would then not necessarily need a credential. However, who actually does the assessment of what falls under the low, moderate, high, or critical categories still needs to fall to the ICAM governance structure, which is usually a combination of IT folks as well as like identity folks. And so if they approve the use of these bots, the creation of these bots by federal workers, then this would still follow the playbook that we have as long as those bots are in the low category.
Yeah, so I would just also add on to that. I mean, if you're allowing your employees or workers to create their own bots, I would look towards limiting it somehow based on the type of employee. So if you you know, not allowing admins or anyone with any type of admin access to maybe be able to create or use a bot using that type of account. Like Daria mentioned, if a bot does fall, maybe you can create parameters in how employees create bots, so it always falls within that low. So in that low, right, you don't necessarily need to assign a sponsor or custodian to everyone. And that's based on those 6 factors of, you know, what type of data does the bot access, what type of, what is the function of it? Does it have access to internal or external networks? What are the privileges that the bot needs to perform its duties? So for example, if I was to use a bot to access public information and then spit out a CSV, that could possibly fall within the low, and that doesn't need a custodian or even its own separate credential. Within the playbook, we have 2 use cases that explain different use cases, and that's actually one of them, where you have a bot that's accessing public information and not really providing any insight, not accessing anything that's not and your average person could access, and that would fall in the low category, which would not require any of the validation process or sponsorship process, but that's really up to like an individual agency policy, whether they want to enforce that or not. I believe that hopefully that answered the question. So moving on to the third step here, we've got one last polling question. Do you assign specific identity attributes that apply only to digital workers? Yes. No, we use the same attributes for both digital and human workers, and no, we do not assign any additional identity attributes to digital workers. So where do you fall within that scope? Yes, no, and no. Yes. This group is on point today, following all the recommendations here. So that's great. That's great. 63% said yes. That's amazing. So step 3, this is really my bread and butter. This is the part that really kind of the fun part is provisioning the identity. So we mentioned, if it's low, if this digital worker falls within that low adverse impact area, it may not require its own identity. But if your agency does require all digital workers to have an identity, then this would be the recommended approach for that. So this actually encompasses both elements within your identity management system, and then also additional data elements that could be an identity governance system, or maybe your own agency customized the process for managing identity governance components. So the first one is capturing data elements within your identity management system. So some of the additional data fields that we recommend using for a digital worker is a Boolean option. Yes or no, this is or is not a digital worker. Assigning a unique user ID that could encompass some acronym, maybe DW for digital worker in the user ID, so you can uniquely identify it just by looking at it. You're including the digital worker sponsor name and custodian name within one of the data fields, so that if you were to come across, say you're using Active Directory, and you were to come across the identity, you could see who the custodian and the sponsor are, and maybe contact them if you have any specific questions. Excuse me. And maybe even a description, have that digital worker profile be a little helpful and describe the purpose of that digital worker. Maybe you have some central repository within your agency where someone can go look at the various digital worker templates that are available, and then be able to select a specific digital worker to help perform a task. The second step is capture and storing the identity governance elements. So identity governance are all of the pieces within that validation process. So it's capturing and storing those somewhere, and then using that for recertification and re-acknowledgement on a periodic basis, whether that period is 6 months or 1 year, so that it aligns with your agency process. So some of the additional elements that would be captured within the identity governance system, it could be the adverse impact level. It could also include maybe IP ranges that digital worker should only be able to access. The dates of those ethics and bias reviews, the code reviews, and also the recertification. So within that periodic basis, the custodian, the sponsor and custodian should be recertifying the purpose and function of that digital worker to make sure that it hasn't drifted outside of its normal operating procedures. So it looks like we have a question in here. So can you elaborate on how a digital worker account is differentiated from a service account? Both have potential to run automations and perform interactions in various systems. So it really depends on what identity management system you're using, because while they could look the same from an identity management perspective, really the importance of uniquely identifying a digital worker from other types of accounts is pretty important. So Daria, did something specific around differentiating between types of accounts come up in any of the agency interviews?
Yeah, a little bit. So one of the things that we did notice is that with the service accounts, they don't quite have the same fields as with what we're hoping to have with a digital worker account. And that service account still either needs to be run through somebody else or through an admin account. Whereas what we're trying to propose is that digital worker accounts should be much more equivalent to a normal worker and not necessarily a service account that just kind of runs in the background. We're not trying to get rid of service accounts. This would be in addition to service accounts, if that makes sense.
Great, thanks, Daria. So there's one more question in here. So to Cliff's point, when would it be acceptable to have a digital worker with a critical risk level, as well as the ability to analyze, develop solutions, and implement said solution without human intervention? So can you provide an example? And I would just say the risk level, and the risk level is really within the playbook we're calling an adverse impact level. The adverse impact level hopefully shouldn't hinder the purpose of your digital worker, but it's to provide compensating controls and specific identity components to lower the potential fraud, risk, and abuse that digital worker may have access to based on using like current identity and digital worker practices.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
and for this, I think I can add, just as an example, for instance, a digital worker that would have a critical risk level. If you think about, for instance, air traffic control, an AI system does make sense in order to put into air traffic control. That would be at a critical level. It's, potential deaths across the board. That is not something we're trying to prevent from implementing. We are just trying to say that if you do want to go in that direction, let's just make sure that we have the right identity for this bot or for this AI, as well as the right controls to ensure that there's validations and certifications that this bot is monitored.
Great. All right, we got one more question. So ethics and bias are relevant to AI design and use, but what is the relevance to how the AI is credentialed?
And I believe I can take that one as well. So for the bias, when we are talking about bias, we're actually talking about specifically the mathematical bias. And what we have here as kind of like what we propose for code reviews, we propose that the ethics and mathematical bias of the AI design do need to be reevaluated at certain points. Normally this would happen before it would go into production, but then also anytime there is a either for high or critical, a periodic yearly or every 6 months review, as well as if there's any huge updates to the functionality of that AI. So it's kind of like grouping together an ethics review of what the AI does, as well as a mathematical bias to the underlying data going into the AI, especially for machine learning, in addition to a code review that should be fairly standard practice for most folks out there.
Great, thanks, Daria. And I would also compare it to, you know, one of the best practices just in general for identity management and access control is a periodic review of access types. And so, I mean, specific to the ethics and bias review, if there is a drift, it could impact its level of access. If the scope of that digital worker changes and that level of access also needs to change with it, it's part of that governance review to make sure that you're still enforcing least privilege on all of your workers also. So the main takeaways from step 3, so data elements for monitoring and tracking digital workers are currently tailored to human workers, right? There's this kind of theme across all the playbooks, is that using your human worker identity lifecycle may not fit your digital workers. So you want to tailor a specific process. You want to tailor your digital worker identity management to the type of worker that it is. And the second takeaway, so there's a lack of consistency across agencies and identity attributes for digital workers. And so we're hoping that these recommendations will provide that consistent process to realize the benefit of a digital workforce when you're looking at IT modernization and automation, that you can implement new technologies and not and still apply a risk management process to it. All right, so closing thoughts. So I had mentioned that when our playbook is ready to be published, I can share the link. It is going to be published most likely on idmanagement.gov. We covered the 3 steps. Step 1, determining the impact, conducting that risk assessment, using those 6 criteria. The step 2, which is creating a sponsorship and custodian process to put governance over your digital worker. And step 3 is provisioning that identity. So you're uniquely identifying digital workers, and then using specific identity attributes to both provision it securely and also manage and govern all identities, human and digital, within your agencies. Daria, you got any closing thoughts?
I think you said it all. Thank you, Ken. Open to any kind of questions you guys have. Anything that we can get into details more about. I'm sure once you guys see the playbook, a lot of your questions will be answered, but unfortunately can't share it with you at this time. So happy to answer any questions that we can.
It's coming soon. Ken and Daria, if I could just go ahead and ask a live question here. So in your interview process with input for the playbook, did folks share with you some of the biggest challenges they have around credentialing? Was it simply, lack of guidance, Ken, as you pointed out, lack of consistency in guidance and so on, or were there other challenges that folks are seeing? A lot of folks that I see are just getting into this, so understanding, what challenges they might run into in this front would be helpful.
So there definitely was some lack of guidance and not so much consistency. I think it was more so that every agency didn't want to start from scratch on figuring out how to do this work to separate digital workers from regular corporeal workers. Honestly, the big thing when we were doing all of our interviews was that there was a huge kind of, I guess, mental barrier for a lot of folks on going from an attended to an unattended digital worker. And honestly, in all of the work that we've done, and you'll see this in our recommendations as well, that leap is actually very, very minor compared to some of the other factors that really need to be assessed, more so about what data does this digital worker have access to, and what other systems does this digital worker have access to. So, you know, how much damage can this digital worker actually do? Whether attended or unattended, it can still do a great amount of damage, and that was not a big enough factor to really push it over from, you know, a low to a moderate or moderate to critical.
Are you concerned that there's currently a lack of oversight, I guess I would use, on attended automation from that point of view?
If you'd asked me this question a year ago, I would say yes. But we have seen a lot of agencies, not a lot, but a number of agencies really pushing for the unattended model and going towards unattended and becoming more comfortable with it. So there is progress in that area, and we'll see where it goes from here.
So long as they document the risk, as you pointed out.
Exactly.
Right, the risk assessment. Well, great. Looks like we have a question that came in.
Yeah, it looks like, so as a question for you, Bill, so to supplement this incredible playbook, are there any additional resources from the private sector that you find valuable when it comes to making credentialing for digital workers approachable?
Yeah, I know that, you know, a lot of private sector organizations are coming out with, certainly there's tools within the platforms that allow you to audit what automations are doing or what bots are doing, whether they're attended or unattended. You know, I strongly recommend that you use, you know, what we call from Automation Anywhere, which is a control room that is monitoring what bots are doing so you can audit it on a regular basis. And not only that the tool allows you to audit it, that you're actually leveraging that data as well. So I recommend using those tools.
Great. Well, I have a quick question, for you, Bill.
Sure.
So based on our outline of the playbook, I mean, where does this fall in within the group's, I guess, like a combination of interest area, or if it's come up before, like is identity management like a topic within this project team? Has it come up before? What kind of, I guess, discussions have you had around this area?
Yeah, I reached out to you guys as soon as I heard about the playbook because it is such a hot topic. What I would say is the number one question is, what are people actually using, you know, automation for? What are they doing? What are the use cases? And what we're seeing now is that now that we're approximately 2, you know, maybe 3 years into using bots and automation, we're seeing organizations move to more complex automations. You know, the low-hanging fruit, the simple tasks. A lot of organizations who first put their toe in the water in this space saw great success, huge savings of labor hours, and ultimately dollar savings, tax dollar savings. And so now what's interesting is they're getting pressure from management up above to say, what else can we apply this to? What else can we do? And as soon as you begin to push the boundaries of what you're looking at doing with automation, security becomes the number one issue. And as I mentioned in my intro, you know, step number one of looking at security is how are we credentialing these bots? You know, doing a detailed risk assessment upfront before you, you know, apply for the credentials for those bots. I found today's presentation really interesting. The topic around there is a difference between a non-person entity and a digital worker. That's I think it's important that people understand that. I don't think that that has been widely publicized. And then I'm looking forward to seeing the details in the playbook where we can, identify what a appropriate risk assessment looks like, and then procedures for getting it approved and so on. Obviously, that would be different agency to agency, but I'm sure your playbook addresses that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that was one of the, I would say, consistent comments that we received back on the playbook was, why are we creating this new category called a digital worker when, right, my agency just calls that an MPE.
Right.
My background is a little bit more on the public key infrastructure side, where from a public key infrastructure perspective, MPE is really servers, devices, like some type of hardware that you want to put a certificate on. I think what MPE is kind of in the eye of the beholder. Maybe within the agency, they want to categorize digital worker as MPE, maybe a special category as MPE. I mean, I would say it's really up to the individual agency. But if you look at purposes, like what is the purpose of this, right? I think automated technologies have a pretty distinct purpose than a server, but it's up to the agency to decide what words they want to use when calling something.
Agreed. A server isn't going to roam the network and touch multiple systems. It has a different purpose.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, I see Cliff had a question. Don't leave it up to the agency and need consistency. Yeah, that's true. That's true. And that's part of what we're trying to do is help do that, provide that consistency across agencies. But at the same time, this guidance isn't a policy. We're not, dictating what agency should and shouldn't do. So if within your agency you have a policy that says if you're either a human or a non-person entity, then that's your own agency. If you don't and you're looking for guidance, by all means, use our playbook as that recommendation for you.
And Kathleen, I see you asked the question, what was the product that I mentioned that I called Control Room? Control Room is part of the Automation Anywhere RPA platform or automation platform. So if you're interested in more about that, happy to answer any questions you've got. Feel free to reach out to me. All right, I think we're up against our time. I really appreciate Ken and Daria, you joining today. This has been super helpful. As soon as the playbook is out, Kirsten, I'm sure we'll go ahead and share it on the ATARC site in the RPA working group links as well. So thanks again.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Daria.